I would love to invite Erwin Wagenhofer, the director of the film of which we have seen a short piece of, to join. Hello. And I... before you guys start to have questions to Richard, I would like to introduce you by one question for each of you. I start with Erwin Wagenhofer, the director. When I think of movies and mindfulness, to my mind comes the experience that films, movies in recent years trying to attract awareness of the audience by becoming faster and faster. If you compare a movie which is 20 or 3 years old, my kids, for example, say, oh, that's too boring for me. There are no cuts, it's not fast, it's very slow. And then we saw your film, which is quite slow. Camera often not moving. And the sound is important. You once said that you, when you was a child, was thinking about becoming a jazz trumpet player and then decided to become a filmmaker because you can tell stories better. And I think the sound is pretty important in your films. It tells a lot of stories because the sound is moving around and not always one-to-one of what we see. But I'm surprised, how do people react when they see these kind of slow films, which they are not used to see anymore because video clips, music clips, contemporary movies are so much faster?
Well, so first of all, I think I'm not the right person to ask that question. You have to ask the audience. So you want that I talk about filmmaking, or is that your question?
No, I think my question is, you're right, maybe you don't know how they react, but you can imagine that you have something in mind when you decided not to go with this current trend or this year-long trend to make films faster and to cut them,
okay.
and to decide to have these slow images and not moving camera. There must be a decision to,
okay.
Why you do that.
Okay, I would like to switch in German. Is that possible? Yeah. Ich glaube, das Wort Filmmacher ist falsch. Es müsste in Wirklichkeit heißen Filmdiener. Und ich glaube auch nicht, dass man einen Film machen kann. Ich glaube nur, dass er gelingen kann. Und wenn etwas falsch ist auf einem Filmplakat, dann ist es folgender Satz. Dort steht ein Film von und dann steht irgendein Name dort. Und das müsste eigentlich heißen, ein Film durch. Und das beantwortet, glaube ich, jetzt einen Teil dieser Frage. Ein Film durch mich, der schaut dann eben so aus. Und ich versuche auch in diesen Arbeiten nichts zu beweisen. Ich suche einen Beitrag abzuliefern. Also es geht mir um Inspiration und nicht um Impression. Und das ist der Grund, warum ich kann es eigentlich gar nicht richtig. Ja, ich versuche in einen Zustand zu kommen, wo ich eigentlich mehr empfange, wo das Empfangen wichtiger ist. Und dann schaut es eben so aus. Also ich kann es eigentlich analytisch gar nicht auf den Punkt bringen, aber vielleicht haben Sie es irgendwie mitbekommen, was ich meine.
Well, thank you. Next to you is sitting Andreas de Bruyn. He's a professor for mindfulness and meditation in Munich, a quite interesting professorship. But that's not all what he is or what he has done in life. He's an expert in Renaissance painting and painting of the Golden Age. He studied economics, social anthropology, psychology, music education. And what I found so extremely interesting, that you, if I got it right, studied 18 years. So you took a long time for learning, and it's quite the opposite of what we have seen in the movie, where young people are trained to do it fast, fast, fast. and not to take the time. So I'm wondering, what do you tell your students? How should they plan or not plan their life? How should they deal with time in today's competitive thinking that you should be fast, quick, the first one? And yeah, that comes to my mind when I saw your CV.
Well, thank you for this question. First of all, thank you very much that I can be here. It's really great to be among so many young people. This is a great feeling, and I agree. The 2 meditations that we did together, I am meditating 8 years long with all my students, and I do meditation for 30 years, but it was really great. Great to meditate with you all together. This is a very interesting question. I think yesterday, Richard, we heard from you, life and learning belong together. We learn till the end of our life. If we want to, we can. It's true, I did a lot of different things, studied. I have some studies, finished some studies. And for me, it was always a thing about an interest in what I wanted to learn. And you know what's very important is what I also explain my students, but I must be true. In my first 2 studies, I didn't do this, and in my school time, neither. If you are somewhere, think immediately about what does this has to do with me? Why am I sitting here? Why am I learning at the moment? Build a bridge to the things people tell, and build your own bridge. So, this is what I learned over the years. I took a very long time. All things together, and this might be also interesting, you can learn a lot about life. To pay my studies, I had to do a lot of extra jobs. I was all the things you can imagine. A guitar player on the street. I worked in all kinds of factories, also at night, and I learned a lot about the people. How do they live? How do they think? And so on. This is the one point that I tell my students. Live your life, the art of living, for you all together. And the other point is, of course, we speak here about mindfulness and meditation, and Richard did 2 exercises with us, spoke about the mind. I'm a professor actually for meditation, mindfulness. It doesn't mean that I know exactly, I do this for 30 years, but it doesn't say something about the quality. But these techniques help us to get more inwardly to ourselves, that you learn to know yourself more better, and that you can bring this creativity, and you all have this, into society.
Well, thank you. Next to you is Kathrin Höckl. She describes herself as learning designer or designer of learning. She worked many years at the OECD in their Department of Education. What we have seen your boss in his film. So you're an expert for what he was describing. And one of the jobs you did there was advising politicians, if I got it right. So I'm wondering, are politicians really aware of what's going on? Would meditation helps them to become maybe even more aware than what they already are? What is your experience in that?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it is always interesting to see or hear the voice of my former boss now in this completely different setting, because I moved away from working as an international analyst at the OECD in Paris to now being a freelance writer and also becoming filmmaker about mindfulness and education, the current project. And one of the reasons I left the OECD a few years ago was that I thought there should be more to education than this sort of approach. And also that the whole world of people working in institutions like the OECD, and you mentioned policymakers, which is sort of a similar world. They're quite detached. Mostly they're quite detached from what's going on in real life, let's put it that way. And I guess practicing some form of meditation being the kind of formal practice that we just were introduced here, or be it different forms of meditation or mindfulness. I practice sports a lot. That's kind of my approach to it. Is always helpful. I think when answering your questions about policymakers, I think what would be most helpful is to be much more in touch with real life and not to be detached so much from what's actually going on, to be more aware in a way of the actual needs of students and teachers and everyone involved in the education system. And I think in a way combining learning and education on the one hand and life on the other hand, that would be the most important thing to do for the future. And the young gentleman over there in the corner, I think, maybe mentioned something that was to me very central, which is, at which point in your education career were you actually aware of what you're doing? What do you actually remember? If we here think back to our school or when we were learning, what do we remember? Often it's not a lot, and what we remember are very lively, very conscious, very intense moments. And I think in general, would there be more life in schools and learning on the one hand, and more learning in life? I think that would be probably a brighter future, and in that sense also more links to real life and for policymakers, for sure. Yeah.
Well, thank you. And then I would like to introduce our last dialogue partner to Richard, Karlheinz Valtl. He's working at the Zentrum für Lehrerinnenausbildung, so he's teaching the teachers. He's educating your teachers. He also, for sure, studied education and psychology. He also is writing in his CV that he was working 2 years as a street musician. And in the last, I think, I only saw the last 3 or 4 seminars, 4 years of what kind of seminars you're giving to the teachers of you. One is how to implement mindfulness in schools. So that's clearly what we are talking about. And then you also given another seminar about sexual education in schools. And so I'm wondering, is there a link between mindfulness in schools and sexual education in schools, or are these just accidentally 2 different directions of what your research interest in the last years have been?
Well, that's quite an unexpected question, because I left behind that topic, or I tried to do so, for about 10 years, but it always comes back to me because there are not many teachers at the university who deal with sexual education. Apparently, it seems very demanding on them. So it always comes back, and currently I give seminars, but I do not really think much about that connection with mindfulness. But hearing the question, I think there is one. When I started that new topic of mindfulness in education, I found myself well prepared to do that, because there are many practices, exercises that can be done in educational contexts that are very similar, because in both spheres you try to be in the present, right where you are, being open, being available to whoever is with you, and also being able to be on your own and deal with yourself, deal with your mind. I think I learned a lot through these 2 or 3 decades that I dealt with sex education for the new topic of mindfulness. And also, there is some discussion about mindful sex. And up to now, I didn't read much about that, but I think it's a good field of application of mindfulness, because there is a lot of discussion about mindfulness used as a method to boost our capacities for work and mainly work. And we should not lose the awareness that not everything is about work and performance, but it's also about being and being happy and being connected. And I think in this point, both these topics can be linked to each other.
Well, thank you. Now everybody knows who's sitting there, and the idea is that these 4 people are now asking questions to you. I will hand over my mic to Erwin, that he also can pose questions, but I will take the advantage to have a first question to you, because I'm an architect and I was surprised that you ask, where is the mind? So the spatial question, and not what is the mind. So why did you decide to ask this spatial where question?
Because it's an easier question.
But you didn't get an easy answer.
It's a place to start. Yeah.
Yeah, I have one. You know, I come from the field of education, and so this is my perspective on neuroscience. And I have a question that is somewhat skeptical. And so I would like to stress first that I really admire your work and I love your books. And especially the last one, Alter Traits, was a huge revelation to me. It gives a summary of contemplative neuroscience on top scientific level, and at the same time builds a bridge to age-old spiritual wisdoms about the transformation of the human mind and soul through meditation. And
Thank you.
that's not yet the question, sorry.
I know. I'm just thanking you.
And this transformation, as I see it, is all what education is about. I would define pedagogy as the science of fostering human development and transformation, and also that bridge between science and spirituality is crucial for my work on mindfulness in education. So, when I read your book, I was keen to read something about education. But when it comes to education, all the wonderful knowledge displayed on neuroscience shrivels up to just one tiny little suggestion: let's make a computer-based app to train some competencies. I may have overread some paragraphs that are more there on education, but for me it appeared like this is like giving up on the subject. It is like having no ideas on how to capitalize on neuroscience in real life, face-to-face education. And I somehow understood you leave it to others to draw the educational consequences out of your work. But I'm afraid this might not be such a wise thing to do, because there is a broad tendency now to overestimate neuroscience and take tiny pieces of neuroscientific knowledge as a proof for generalized statements that go far beyond what scientific evidence supports. And on the other side, there are scientists, especially in education, that say we do not learn much from neuroscience, as it just tells us where in the brain things happen. But to interpret these physical processes, you need higher order knowledge taken from psychology. And so the assertions from neuroscience are circular. They read out the data, what they invest as knowledge to interpret them. I think both these tendencies are biased and unrealistic, but I would like to take the chance to ask you for first-hand information. And my question is, and it's a big one, which consequences related to education can we realistically draw from neuroscience? Or put the other way around, which strategies of contemplative education are supported by robust data from neuroscience?
Yeah, so thank you for your reflections and for your questions. And let me just preface it by saying that I very much agree with you with regard to your skepticism about how neuroscience has been used by educators. For the most part, I think that neuroscience has not contributed in very meaningful ways, and I think that educators have trivialized neuroscience in a certain way and used it to simply describe what is being done in kind of neurospeak terms, not particularly accurate and not particularly informative. And so I very much share your implicit concerns about that. But let me give you one example where I think that there is something important that we can learn from neuroscience that has really important implications for education that I think have really not been sufficiently appreciated. And that is the distinction between what neuroscientists call declarative learning and procedural learning. Declarative learning is learning about stuff. So we can teach in a classroom about the value of kindness, but that will not necessarily educate children to become kinder. Most of the work using social and emotional learning, unfortunately, is declarative. In contrast to declarative learning, we have procedural learning. Procedural learning is instantiated in completely different brain circuits. And procedural learning is embodied learning. It's habit learning. It is embodied learning. And this kind of learning requires practice. And in order for skills to be acquired, they need to be acquired procedurally. And so it's not that one form of learning should be privileged over another. They're both critical, but they're both critical. And the vast majority of our educational enterprise in the West is predicated on the faulty assumption that declarative learning is supreme and is the way to really educate. And it's leaving out a whole other way of learning that we know from neuroscientific studies engages completely different circuits in the brain and is actually necessary in order for skills of the kind that we're talking about to emerge and to flourish. So that's one example.
Thank you.
Yes, I have tons of questions, but there's one thing I'm constantly, quite practically wondering about. I tried to formulate a brief question. So the kind of mindfulness practice that's comes across as something at a quite high and abstract and almost in a way advanced level. How can you bring that into very basic school forms, let's say in with problem kids in suburbs? To me, this is so far apart, these two worlds, and I just wonder whether you had any experience, personal or as an observer, how you can bring these two worlds successfully together, or in other terms, what can these kind of schools, what kind of advantage can they take from that kind of mindfulness practice?
Yeah, so part of our work involves directly working with children in real school contexts, beginning with preschool all the way through high school and university. And we've worked at all grade levels. And it's quite easy to do this, but it doesn't look like meditation for an adult. And so one of the things that we do, for example, with young preschool children, kids 5 years of age, including kids with, quote, attentional problems. And I think if we're honest with ourselves, modern culture suffers from an attentional disorder. We all suffer from an attentional disorder. We don't need a formal diagnosis. And in fact, there are very good scientific data to show that kids in today's world who don't have a diagnosis are a lot less attentionally capable than kids 50 years ago on the same exact measures before there was an introduction of digital devices. And so one of the things we do with 5-year-old kids, for example, is we ring a bell. And we simply say to the children, please listen carefully to the sound. And as soon as you no longer hear it, raise your hand. And for the 10 seconds or so that the bell is audible, the classroom is completely still. And we've done this not just in regular public schools, but we've also done this in classrooms with, quote, differently abled children, kids with diagnoses, and they too can taste the value of stillness. And so it's only 10 seconds, but that's all it takes for them to really get this experientially. It's so hard for adults to get it compared to 5-year-olds. 5-year-olds get it instantaneously. And so you can do simple things of that sort, and they completely get the experience because they feel it, and it's very accessible.
So do I understand correctly, any kind of teacher in any kind of school can practice this with success?
That's not what I said.
Kind of.
Any teacher in any school context can try it and see.
Well, Andreas, I think the rule is clear. You're the next one. We did an art meditation with you today. That's one of the way how you combine your art history background with meditation and mindfulness. We did it a bit too fast and too short, but for me it was very impressive. I don't know what your experience was, how you felt meditating in front of an artwork, or if you practice in that as well. But well, now you have the chance to pose a question to Richie.
Okay. Well, I'm very curious about the intuition. And one says sometimes that we have also something. We all know this, no? Sometimes you know something without thinking about it, right? And it can come from the stomach. This is maybe more the instinct, but it sometimes comes from somewhere else. And is there done any research on the topic of intuition?
Yes, there's lots of research on intuition, and we often have feelings or insights that just sort of spontaneously occur. People often say that an idea comes to them when they're in the shower or taking a walk or something like that. And I think that one of the important invitations in the kind of work that I was describing is that if we pay more attention to our own minds, if we become more familiar with our own minds, we'll actually notice all the creative stuff that happens continuously. We're all very creative beings, and we pay so little attention to what's going on inside. But if we paid more attention, we can, I think, notice some of these creative insights, which I think happen much more frequently than most people acknowledge because we're not paying attention. We're not aware of what's going on. One of the things that I tell my graduate students that I'd like them to do for at least a couple of hours every week is to sit and pay attention to their thoughts. Simply, without any books, without any notes, but simply notice their thoughts. We don't spend much time doing that, and I think that if we do that more regularly, we will appreciate how rich our minds are and how creative our minds are, and we'll be able to harness that information more effectively.
Okay, thanks.
Do you also have a question to
No,
Richard?
no, just to have thank you. I would like to say.
Well,
Thank you so
that could be the perfect ending. But if you don't have a question, I will take the chance to have a last question to you. When I came here, to be honest, I was expecting that you're giving a talk.
That's what I was expecting too.
And then you started...
Something else came out.
Then you started to post questions. And on the one hand, to be honest, I was disappointed because I love talks as a form of high-density information from someone who's knowing much more than I do. And this is one of the reasons why I like to listen to this kind of dialogue with dance examples from your side. On the other hand, I like the performative mode. And so my question is it a common style of you that you do it this way, or did it just happened, or because we are here in school, or what is the reason? What is your experience with this performative question instead of talk style?
Well, thank you for asking that question. And to be perfectly honest, I came with a whole PowerPoint presentation, was about to show slides, but I sat up here and just sort of observed. And I felt that that would be completely inappropriate for this audience. And so in its place, thank you. So I chose to do something differently that just I was moved to do. And I honestly don't do this very often, but I really very much appreciated the audience, what's left of it, and you guys have a very wonderful school, and you're all very, very fortunate to have such a nurturing learning environment, and I wish you all the best. Thank you.
Well, maybe one of the reasons that you felt that it's inappropriate to give a traditional talk situation in here is the art installation done by the students and Dominic, Emmanuel, and Benita. So thank you, the three of us and all the students, for giving us this wonderful, different situation to be an audience or to be in touch with a talker. I also never sit like that inside of an audience. I really like it, so thank you very, very much. That was also a very great experience. Thank you for GLOBArt, for the school and the cloister to let that happen here. Thank you, all of you, for being here. Maybe just one last little remark. When I came here, I was sitting in the subway, my mind was drifting away, and suddenly I was listening to an automatic female voice saying, "Sei achtsam," be mindful. And I think it was at Rossauer Ländle, and she was reminding me that there's a gap between the train and the platform. But for me, it was a nice start to come here. This voice saying to me, be aware, and I learned today that awareness and mindfulness is much, much more than to be aware of the train and the platform. So, safe trip home. Thank you to all of us, and seid achtsam, be mindful, and have a nice day.